The 12th of August, 1945. The air over Camp Gordon, Georgia, was a heavy, wet blanket, thick with the scent of pine needles and damp red clay. Inside the sprawling prisoner-of-war mess hall, the drone of 1,000 cicadas outside was the only sound that dared to challenge the tense, suffocating silence. Captain Helen Morrison of the Women's Army Corps stood with her arms crossed, her crisp uniform wilting in the oppressive heat, her gaze fixed on a scene of profound and maddening frustration. Before her, arranged at long wooden tables, sat 300 captured German women. The tables groaned under the weight of a Southern Sunday meal, platters piled high with glistening, slow-roasted pork, bowls of savory Brunswick stew, mountains of skillet-fried cornbread, and heaps of dark, tender collard greens. Real butter, a luxury even for many Americans, sat in small dishes, slowly melting into golden pools. But the women were not eating. It was not for a lack of hunger. One look at their gaunt faces, the hollows beneath their cheekbones and the sunken, haunted look in their eyes told a story of severe, prolonged malnutrition. Yet, every time a platter of the pit-cooked pork was passed to them, they would recoil as if from a serpent. They pushed the plates away, their expressions a mixture of desperate longing and abject terror. Some wept silently into their hands, their shoulders shaking with a grief Morrison could not comprehend. What was happening here? The supplies were genuine, procured from local Georgia farms. The food was plentiful, the rations generous by any military standard. Why would these women, starved and defeated, choose the agony of hunger over a nourishing meal? The answer, when it came, was so outlandish, so monstrous, that it seemed to belong to a medieval nightmare, not the modern world. A young prisoner, a former radio operator who spoke a smattering of English, approached Captain Morrison, her body trembling. She leaned in close, her voice a barely audible whisper, thick with fear. "We believe the meat it is from the dead prisoners," she stammered, her eyes darting around the room. "We were told the Americans would resort to cannibalism when we were no longer of use." Morrison felt a cold shock, a paralysis that had nothing to do with the Georgia heat. For weeks, the camp authorities had been wrestling with this mystery, watching these women waste away, never once suspecting the true cause. It wasn't the food they feared, but its supposed origin. The insidious propaganda of Goebbels had planted a seed of horror so deep that it had choked out the most basic human instinct for survival. In that moment, Morrison understood that her mission was no longer simply about providing sustenance. What she was about to orchestrate would not only fill these women's empty stomachs, it would have to be powerful enough to purge their minds of a poison that had been fed to them for years. It would have to prove that everything they had been taught about the soul of America was a grotesque and deliberate lie. The 300 German women at Camp Gordon were a cross-section of the Third Reich's female auxiliaries, captured across France and Germany in the final, chaotic months of the war, between March and May of 1945. They were members of the Waffen-SS Helferinnenkorps, munitions factory workers, military nurses, and communications operators. Their ages ranged from a 17-year-old girl who had barely left childhood to a weary woman of 52. All had been subjected to the full, relentless force of Nazi ideological training, a curriculum that included explicit, terrifying warnings about American savagery. They had been shown doctored photographs, gruesome images purported to be German prisoners being tortured by grinning GIs. They had been told lurid tales of mass violations, of a barbaric army that held nothing sacred. And most disturbingly, they had been warned that when resources grew scarce, the pragmatic, soulless Americans would turn to the ultimate atrocity, cannibalism, starting with the weakest and most disposable prisoners. When these women were finally captured, they expected immediate execution or a brutal, short life of enslavement. Instead, the reality they encountered was one of bewildering contradiction. They were transported on ships in reasonable conditions, processed through a series of standard, almost mundane bureaucratic procedures, and sent by train deep into the American South, to Camp Gordon. Here, they were assigned to clean barracks with individual cots, given access to showers with hot water, and provided 3 meals a day. But it was the food, the very symbol of their humane treatment, that became the insurmountable problem. For the first 2 weeks at the camp, the prisoners subsisted on bread, vegetables, and fruit, stubbornly refusing any and all animal protein. The camp's medical staff first assumed it was a religious or cultural preference. But as the women began to exhibit the clear and dangerous signs of severe protein deficiency, malnutrition, lethargy, edema, muscle wasting, despite the abundance of food, Captain Morrison knew she had to intervene. It was then, after careful and patient questioning, that she finally unearthed the horrifying truth of their indoctrination. She convened an urgent meeting in the sweltering office of the camp commander, Colonel James Patterson, a stern but fair man whose face was etched with the weariness of a long war. The camp chaplain, Captain Robert Sullivan, a man whose gentle demeanor belied a core of unshakable conviction, was also present. Morrison laid out the situation in stark terms. 300 women were slowly starving themselves because Nazi propaganda had convinced them that American soldiers were cannibals. "We can show them all the procurement documents we want, Colonel," Morrison said, her voice tight with frustration. "We can present certificates proving the meat comes from local livestock. They won't believe a word of it. To them, we are the enemy, and everything we say is a lie." Patterson nodded grimly, leaning back in his chair, the wood creaking in protest. "She's right. After years of that poison being dripped into their ears, no amount of paperwork is going to change what they believe in their bones. They need proof. Visceral, undeniable proof that shatters the entire narrative they've been living inside." A heavy silence fell over the small office, broken only by the whirring of a solitary fan pushing the hot air around. Then, Chaplain Sullivan leaned forward, his eyes thoughtful. "My people are from down near Savannah," he said, his voice carrying the soft, rolling cadence of a native Georgian. "Every summer, my granddaddy would host a community pig roast. We'd dig a pit, get a whole hog from a neighbor, and cook it for 12, sometimes 14 hours, right out in the open where everyone could see. The whole process, from the living animal to the final plate, was a public spectacle. It was a celebration." He paused, looking from Morrison to Patterson. "What if we did that here? What if we held an authentic, Georgia-style pit barbecue and made the prisoners watch every single step?" The genius of the idea struck Morrison with the force of a revelation. It was a piece of theater, a ritual of transparency. If the women saw the live animals with their own eyes, saw them processed, saw the raw pork being seasoned and prepared, watched it cook slowly over hickory coals for half a day, and then, finally, saw the American soldiers eating the very same meat alongside them, the Nazi narrative would not just be challenged, it would be annihilated. The lie was too immense, too grotesque, to be undone with words. It had to be undone with smoke, fire, and the undeniable reality of a shared meal. And so, on the 18th of August, 1945, under the watchful eye of a blistering Georgia sun, the authorities at Camp Gordon staged what was perhaps the most significant barbecue in American military history. At 0600 hours, a detachment of soldiers, young men from Atlanta and Savannah who knew a thing or two about cooking a hog, began digging 3 massive barbecue pits in the red clay of the camp's central common area. At 0730, a dusty truck rumbled through the gates, carrying 3 live hogs from a nearby farm. The animals were paraded past the barracks, and the German women watched from their windows, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and profound dread. At 0800, Army veterinarians dispatched and processed the hogs, following standard sanitary procedures, all in full view of the prisoners. There were no hidden rooms, no secret compartments, just the straightforward, transparent conversion of livestock into meat. By 0900, the Georgia-born soldiers had begun their work. They seasoned the large cuts of pork with traditional Southern rubs, a mix of salt, pepper, paprika, and secret family spices. They placed the meat onto large metal grates suspended over pits filled with smoldering hickory wood. And then began the slow, 10-hour cooking process that defines true Southern barbecue. For those 10 hours, something extraordinary happened. The scent, At first, just the sharp tang of wood smoke slowly deepened into something rich, savory, and overwhelmingly delicious. It was a smell that spoke of community, of celebration, of nourishment. It did not smell of death or horror. It smelled, quite simply, like pork, cooking in the most wonderful way imaginable. The German prisoners, at first cautious, began to emerge from their barracks. They gathered in small, hesitant groups, drawn by the irresistible aroma that filled the entire camp. First, they watched from a distance, then, gradually, they drifted closer. At 1,100 hours, some of the younger women, bolder than the rest, asked if they could observe more closely. Captain Morrison granted permission. The women stood 10 feet from the pits, watching as the soldiers from Savannah basted the meat with a vinegar-based sauce, adjusted the coals, and turned the heavy cuts with practiced ease. The soldiers, instead of ignoring them, began to explain the process, their southern drawls thick and friendly. "This here's what you call a whole hog roast," said a young corporal from Atlanta, pointing with his long-handled fork. "The secret is low and slow. Gotta let that hickory smoke do its work. My granddaddy taught me this method when I was just a boy. Said it was about patience more than anything else." The prisoners didn't understand every word, but they understood the tone. It wasn't hostile or threatening. It was the tone of someone sharing a beloved family tradition with genuine, uncomplicated pride. At 1,400 hours, Morrison made a calculated, risky decision. She invited 10 of the most curious prisoners to help prepare the side dishes. Under the supervision of army cooks, the German women found themselves chopping vegetables for the Brunswick stew, mixing batter for cornbread, and washing collard greens. They worked side by side with American soldiers, following instructions, sharing utensils, creating a meal together. The rigid lines between captor and captive began to blur, replaced by the simple, human act of shared labor. By 1,800 hours, when the pork was finally pulled from the pits, glistening and tender, a fundamental shift had occurred in the atmosphere of the camp. The long tables in the mess hall were arranged for a banquet. American soldiers and German prisoners sat intermingled, a deliberate arrangement by Morrison. There were no armed guards standing over them, only people seated together around food. When the platters of shredded pork were brought out, Morrison watched the prisoners' reactions with breathless anticipation. The first to act was a 34-year-old woman named Margaret Schultz, who had served as a nurse in a military hospital in France. Margaret had been one of the most vocally suspicious prisoners during the preceding weeks, but she had also been one of the most diligent observers of the day's events, watching the entire 10-hour process from start to finish. She had seen the live hogs, the raw meat, the transparent preparation. She took a small piece of pork onto her fork. She examined it, then lifted it to her nose, inhaling the smoky scent. Then, slowly, deliberately, she brought it to her mouth. She chewed in silence, her expression unreadable. And then her eyes filled with tears. "Es ist nur Schweinfleisch," she whispered in German to the woman beside her. "It's just pork.
Es ist wirklich nur Schweinefleisch."
It's really just pork. She began to weep, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming wave of relief, a relief so profound it was painful. It was mixed with a deep, burning shame. Relief that she was not being fed something monstrous, shame that she had believed the lies for so long. Within the next 15 minutes, a chain reaction swept through the hall. All 300 prisoners began to eat. Some cried openly into their plates, the taste of real food mingling with the salt of their tears. Others ate in a stunned, contemplative silence, processing the powerful reality that they had been systematically, cruelly deceived. And some began to ask questions. "Why are you doing this?" a 19-year-old named Erica Hoffman asked through a translator, her voice trembling. "We are your enemies. We worked for the regime that killed your soldiers. Why do you feed us like this? Why do you treat us as human?" Chaplain Sullivan, seated at the same table, provided the answer, his voice calm and steady as the translator relayed his words. "Because you are human," he said simply. "And because the way we treat our defeated enemies says more about us than it does about you." America doesn't just win wars with weapons. We win them by demonstrating that our values are superior to those of the regime that forced you to fight. This isn't just a meal, it's a testament to that belief. That answer was translated and repeated in hushed tones from table to table, and in the hearts of those women, something hardened by years of hatred and fear began to crack. It wasn't instantaneous or dramatic, but it was real. In the weeks that followed, the prisoners at Camp Gordon began to voluntarily participate in educational programs. They learned about American democracy, about human rights, and about the articles of the Geneva Convention that guaranteed their humane treatment. Many openly admitted that they had been indoctrinated with lies. Some wrote letters home to their families in a shattered Germany, describing the treatment they were receiving, letters that would be censored for the time being, but eventually delivered after the war. And every Sunday, the camp authorities held another Georgia-style barbecue. Not because it was still necessary for nutrition, but because it had become a powerful symbol, a weekly ritual that reinforced the truth. It was a reminder that what they had been taught about America was nothing more than propaganda, and that reality was radically, mercifully different. In November of 1945, as the women were gradually repatriated, many asked for permission to write letters of gratitude to Morrison, Patterson, and Sullivan. In those letters, they expressed a profound transformation. "I arrived in Georgia expecting death," Margaret Schultz wrote. "Instead, I found humanity. It was not the food that changed me, but the way you treated me when you had no reason to. I returned to Germany with the responsibility to tell the truth of what I experienced here." Erica Hoffman wrote something similar. The barbecue was not just a meal, it was a lesson in the character of America. "I worked for a regime that taught us to hate. But at Camp Gordon, I learned that true power comes not from fear, but from the dignity with which you treat even those who were once your enemies." Decades later, in 1982, Margaret Schultz returned to Georgia as a visitor. Colonel Patterson had long since retired, but one of the young soldiers who had cooked at that first barbecue still lived in nearby Augusta. His name was Billy Ray Thompson, a man of 64 by then. When Schultz found him, she brought him a gift, a translated book of traditional German recipes. "You taught me that food can be a bridge between enemies," she told him, her voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to return that gift." Thompson accepted the book, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. Then he told her something she had never known. "Ma'am, that barbecue back in 45 wasn't my idea," he said, his Georgia drawl softened with age. "But after I saw you ladies crying when you tasted that real pork, I understood something. The war doesn't end when the guns go quiet. It ends when people stop believing the lies that made them enemies in the first place." Today, nearly 80 years later, the story of the Camp Gordon barbecue is rarely told. There are no monuments, no commemorative plaques. But for the 300 German women who were there, it was the moment they understood the profound power of a simple truth. They were not reformed by lectures or forced re-education. They were reformed by 10 hours of watching pork roast slowly over hickory coals, and by the kindness of Southern soldiers who shared a piece of their home, without hostility. That is the enduring power of humanitarian treatment. It doesn't just demonstrate moral superiority, it utterly destroys the very